You feel it before you understand it. A wrong step, a snap, and then the specific nausea of a bone that isn't where it should be. In the United States alone, over 6 million fractures are treated every year. X-rayed, set, cast, monitored for weeks. You assume this machinery of splints and surgeons is the only reason a broken bone doesn't end a life. Here's the disruption. In 1957, an American archaeologist named Ralph Selecki excavated a cave called Shanidar in northern Iraq. Inside, he found the skeleton of a Neanderthal man, roughly 45,000 years old. This man, now called Shanidar I, had a crushed eye socket that had left him blind on one side. His right forearm had been amputated below the elbow. His skull, ribs, and leg all showed fractures, and every single one of those injuries had healed. He didn't die from them. He lived for years afterward. Some researchers estimate into his late 30s or 40s, old age by Paleolithic standards. A one-armed, partially blind man survived in an Ice Age landscape full of predators, with no metal tools, no antibiotics, and no anesthesia. This is going to change how you think about what actually keeps a human body alive when it breaks, because the science here isn't really about bones. It's about what has to happen around a person for a bone like that to heal at all. Start with the physics of the injury itself. A crushed orbital bone and a severed forearm are not survivable alone in the wild. An injury of that severity would have left Shanidar I unable to hunt, unable to process hides, unable to defend himself for weeks, possibly months. Bone remodeling, the process by which a fracture calcifies and reforms, takes a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks in a healthy modern human eating a full diet. In a Neanderthal with no reliable food source of his own, that window should have been fatal. Eric Trinkhaus, the paleoanthropologist who spent decades studying the Shanidar remains, argued that the healing pattern only makes sense one way. Someone fed him, someone brought him water, someone protected him while his body did the slow, biological work of knitting itself back together. That single skeleton is one of the earliest physical proofs that Homo neanderthalensis practiced sustained, long-term care for the injured, not out of sentiment, but as a survival strategy baked into the group itself. But Shanidar I wasn't an isolated case. 9 other individuals were recovered from that same cave system, and several of them showed the same pattern: old injuries healed long before death on bodies that had no business surviving that long. That's not the whole story. In 2010, a team led by Spanish paleoanthropologist Ana Bastir studied a wider sample of Neanderthal skeletal remains across sites in Europe and the Middle East. Nearly 80% showed evidence of trauma, not scratches, serious trauma, skull fractures, spinal damage, crushed limbs. The rate was so high and so similar to modern rodeo athletes that researchers began calling Neanderthals the rodeo rider hypothesis population. Bodies shaped by repeated, violent, close-range encounters with large animals, and yet the survival rate for those injuries was strikingly high. That's the part that doesn't fit the old picture of prehistoric life as a place where the injured were simply left behind. Here's where it gets stranger. Healing a compound fracture, a broken bone that punctures skin, is not just about time. It is a race against infection. Without antiseptics, without stitches, an open wound in Ice Age Iraq should have gone septic within days. Blood poisoning killed more soldiers in the American Civil War than gunfire did, and that was in the 1860s with rudimentary surgical tools already in existence. So how did a wound like Shanidar I's forearm amputation not kill him through infection alone? The likely answer sits in the plant record. Pollen analysis from Shanidar Cave, first published by botanist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan in 1975, found concentrations of plants with known medicinal properties surrounding one of the burials: yarrow, cornflower, groundsel. The finding was controversial for years, dismissed by some as pollen contamination from burrowing rodents, but later residue analysis on Neanderthal teeth from the site of El Cedrón in Spain, published in Naturwissenschaften in 2012, found chemical traces of yarrow and chamomile directly in dental calculus, plants with no nutritional value, both known for anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial compounds. A Neanderthal was chewing medicine. That means the same species without written language, without metal, without permanent settlements, had already identified which specific plants fought infection in an open wound, knowledge passed down accurately enough to still be detectable 50,000 years later in fossilized tooth plaque. Except there was a problem plant medicine alone couldn't solve. Yarrow and chamomile can slow infection. They cannot reset a shattered bone, and they cannot feed a person who can no longer hunt. Splinting comes first. Analysis of healed fracture sites across Neanderthal remains shows bones that reunited at close to their original angle, not the twisted, malformed healing you'd expect from a limb left to fend for itself. Anthropologist Jerome Kennedy Jr. modeled how this was likely achieved: firm binding using sinew and wood, holding the limb immobile long enough for the bone to knit straight. No X-ray to check alignment, no plaster, just accumulated, transmitted knowledge of which materials held and for how long. Food comes next, and this is the piece that makes Shanidar 1 almost impossible to explain through instinct alone. A blind, one-armed man in an Ice Age valley cannot chase game. He cannot forage efficiently. Trinkhaus calculated that for him to reach the age he did, he would have needed reliable, repeated provisioning from other members of his group for years, not days. That is not a reflex. That is a decision, made collectively, sustained across seasons, with no guarantee of any return on the investment. A group of Neanderthals chose to keep feeding a man who could no longer contribute in the ways that mattered for immediate survival. And that decision shows up again and again in the fossil record once researchers started looking for it. La Chapelle-aux-Saints, France, a Neanderthal skeleton found in 1908 with severe arthritis and tooth loss so extensive he could barely have chewed solid food unaided. Krapina, Croatia, remains showing healed amputations dating back over 100,000 years. Each one is a body that should have been a liability, kept alive anyway. So the real mechanism behind surviving a broken bone 45,000 years ago was never really about the bone. It was plant chemistry accurate enough to fight infection without a microscope. It was splinting precise enough to let bone reform at the correct angle without an X-ray. And underneath both of those, it was a group of people deciding over and over, across generations, that a member who could no longer hunt was still worth feeding. You inherited a body that heals in exactly the same biological way Shanidar 1's did. Same calcium deposition, same 6-week remodeling window, same vulnerability to infection. The only thing that changed in 45,000 years is who or what does the feeding while you wait.